Hi scholars, happy Wednesday. Today should be May 27th, 2020. We're on Unit 9, Chapter 8, our second to last chapter in our unit called Cracking the Case. We only have 2 lessons left. We have today's, Thursday's, and then we have our Unit 9 assessment on Friday. So you should have your packets out to page 187 to 192. Readers should be open to page 50. There in the description beneath our video you'll find the link to our digital reader. Before we get started, we're going to do a little bit of review as well and just go over a physical and chemical change, which we talked about in our last few chapters, and talk about what's coming up as well. So let's get started. This week in review, today, Wednesday, we're doing Chapter 8. Tomorrow's Thursday, Chapter 9. And like I said, we have our Unit 9 assessment on Edulastic on Friday. Next week, our last week of school, on Monday, we have our first part of our end-of-year assessment. On Tuesday, we have our second part of our end-of-year assessment. Both will be on Edulastic. And next Saturday, June 6th, the 6th, we have our 5th grade graduation. So make sure you assess and use that survey that I shared yesterday that we talked about. That's going to let you pick a time slot as well on Saturday from 12 to 3 o'clock for our drive-through graduation. That way you and your family have a time for you guys to come through, celebrate, have your pictures taken, and pick up your diploma. So let's do a little recap. Physical versus chemical changes. So a physical change is when matter changes form or shape, but not chemical identity. It may look different, but it's still basically the same thing on the inside, on its chemical makeup. So things like ice melting, it's still water. The water hasn't changed. Chopping wood hasn't changed the chemical makeup of that wood. If you mix gray and green marbles, it doesn't change the marbles at all, and it's reversible. You can just separate those like nothing happened. And shredding paper. That's even reversible if you had enough tape, but the paper itself isn't any different. A chemical change, remember, is non-reversible and it changes the makeup, the inside and usually outside of something. So if you burn a piece of wood, you can't reverse that. If a banana has rotted or if a piece of fruit goes bad, you can't change that. You can't just, put it in a magical device and make it fresh again. Mixing vinegar and baking soda. If you've ever seen this experiment where people make a little volcano by mixing the two, you can't separate it. In fact, when the two chemicals interact, they form a reaction or a change where they bubble up and look like foam. You can't turn that foam back into vinegar and back into baking soda. And fireworks, once you light the match or light the fuse on a firework, there's no going back. You can't send a firework up in the sky and then put it all back in the tube and do it all over again. It's a chemical reaction inside of there that causes all the colors and sparks. First, we have our do not for the day. You all should be familiar with this one by now. You're going to do a kernel expansion. So our sentence kernel, our small little sentence seed that we're going to expand on. Water experiences physical change. We're going to expand on that. What undergoes a physical change? When does it change? And how does it change? So it might go, water experiences a physical change when ... because ... are when and how. So think of our water cycle, gas, solid, and liquid. How does water experience this change? When might water turn from a water into a vapor? Think about what season when it gets really hot, and think about how it happens. How does water change from a liquid into a solid? How do you change water into an ice cube? So our daily objective, I can use words with a range of affixes and roots to explain how plot lines are resolved, tracking the character's desires. We're going to do a little bit of word work again today. We're going to do some morphology. We're going to use some comma work like we had in our last assessment. Our vocab. You've all heard the word probably fluffy before, but what specifically do you mean when you mean fluffy? You might think of an animal. You might think of a cat or dog that you can pet and they have fluffy fur. It's usually a light texture filled with air. Think of cotton candy. It's not really heavy or hard when you push on it, and it's usually really airy. There's not a lot of solid to it. Intentions. What are your aims or plans? Intentions. It's a noun. So you might ask someone, what are your intentions tonight? Or what do you intend to do this weekend? And appreciate. Appreciate is to recognize the worth of. How do you recognize the worth? I appreciate you. So I recognize your worth. So, for example, we had Teacher Appreciation Week when everyone was supposed to recognize how worthy and great Mr. Sheeline was. Everyone was supposed to appreciate me that week. You might appreciate your parents because of all the things they do for you. You might have a friend or an adult in your life you really appreciate. People might appreciate you as a friend, even. So, your word work, finish writing out these sentences or just answer them. Make sure you restate them when you answer them. So, what do you most appreciate about school? What I appreciate most about school is ... When do you have good intentions that went wrong? When might you have had a good plan that went wrong? Maybe you planned on doing something really fun one weekend and then it all went terrible. And what is your favorite food that can be described as fluffy? Your favorite food that can be described as fluffy. Take a moment, pause the video here, and work on a little bit of our word work, just rewriting the sentences, restating. So before we get started reading Chapter 8 on pages 50 and 57, I have a big question that I just want you to write a 2-sentence prediction about. Why are pancakes light and fluffy? So, I believe pancakes are light and fluffy because ... A reason to support this is ... Give me your belief or your opinion and why you think that. So if you think it's because of specific ingredient, say that, but then you gotta give me a reason why you think that ingredient might have that effect, or if it's a way that it's cooked and prepared. I'm gonna give you a little bit of time to work on this before we start reading on page 50. Now that you've written your prediction down, let's get started at the top of page 50. Chapter 8, Cracking the Case. Breakfast, Tess called out of the front kitchen tent. Come and get it. Amy fell in the step behind her brother. Well, okay, once we've started to eat, I'll pretend to drop something under the table, slip down there, and quickly check the bottom of everyone's shoes. They sat down at a table while the others, just as Tess, came walking up with a huge plate of hot, fluffy pancakes and a bottle of maple syrup. Good morning. This morning's breakfast is brought to you by another amazing chemical change. Felix eyed the pancakes hungrily. Do you think you can explain that statement while we eat rather than before? Absolutely, Tess said, handing him the platter. Last night after the campfire, I was thinking about chemical changes that we encounter every day. Some of the most familiar ones we have to do with food. When people cook or bake things, all sorts of chemical changes take place. For example, pancakes are light and fluffy thanks to a chemical change between two ingredients, baking soda and buttermilk. When these two molecules are mixed together, atoms are rearranged and a new type of molecules are produced. One of these new molecules is the gas carbon dioxide. Tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide gas form throughout the pancake's batter and are trapped as the batter cooks and solidifies. The result is light and fluffy pancakes that are honeycombed with tiny air pockets. So if you said in your prediction it's because pancakes have little air bubbles inside of them, or they're thinner on the inside than they are on the outside, you'd be correct. It's because of this reaction between the baking soda and the buttermilk that creates these little carbon dioxide air, like they're little bubble pockets of air in the pancakes. So when you bite into it, it looks like there's not much on the inside that make it so light and fluffy. Crystal peered at the pancakes on her plate. So that's why they're full of little holes. I always wondered about that. Amy took a bite of her pancakes. It was wonderful, and she wished she could concentrate on simply enjoying them, but she was focused on the result of another chemical change this morning, one that hopefully had left traces on someone's shoes. She waited till everyone was busy eating pancakes, and then casually let her fork slip through her fingers. Whoops, dropped my fork, she said easily, and ducked under the table. She quickly started scanning the bottom of everyone's shoes. Her plan had worked. Amy sat up and stared at Matt while he raised his eyebrows questioningly. She thought for a moment how to communicate her discovery, and then picked up the bottle of maple syrup. Matt, would you pass the syrup to Julian? She said, trying to sound casual. It looks like he needs more. Matt's eyes widened in surprise. Felix was already helping himself to seconds. These pancakes are great, Tess. Too bad Dr. Forrester missed them. She plans to be back before we headed to the dig site, Tess replied. So I'm guessing her and the sheriff will be here soon. I'll make more batter when they arrive. Amy noticed that when Tess said this, Julian swallowed hard and put down his fork. He looked scared. Amy's mind raced as she tried to think of what to do next. Since we're going to put plaster jackets on more fossils at the dig site today, she said, turning to Tess, how about Matt and I load up the plaster of Paris and other things we'll need? That'd be great, Tess said, pouring herself some coffee. I could sit here and relax. Actually, why don't you help us, Julian? Amy added, as she got up from the table. It'll go faster with 3. When Amy stepped inside the lab, she saw the shoe prints in the plaster dust on the floor. They led from the entrance to the table, where all the missing fossil fragments now lay in a neat row. Julian stopped outside the tent entrance and then reluctantly stepped inside. I suspected that whoever took these fossils would bring them back, Amy said quietly, what with the sheriff coming and all. Julian looked about to deny it, but stopped and let out a huge, unhappy sigh. How did you know it was me? Amy explained about the ice, the plaster dust, and the shoes. Julian groaned and sat down heavily on a wooden crate full of tools. I suppose you're going to tell Dr. Forrester when she gets here, and the sheriff. How about you tell us why you took the fossils in the first place? Julian hung his head and said, I didn't really mean to take them. Really. Everything just went wrong. He paused and then plunged ahead. Remember when Dr. Forrester was so excited about the first set of fossils, but wanted us to wait until morning to see them? Well, I didn't want to wait, so I snuck in here later that night to see them for myself. I picked one up to look at it more closely. Then I thought I heard someone coming, and without thinking, I shoved it into my pocket and slipped out the back of the tent. Why didn't you admit it the next morning when Dr. Forrester found it missing and gave it back? Matt asked. It's not like you meant to steal it. She would have believed you. I didn't think she would. I figured she'd be really angry and send me back home, and I didn't want that to happen. I thought I'd just put the fossil back when no one was looking, and she just assumed she had misplaced it. But every time I tried to do that, either Tess or Dr. Forster was here in the lab. Julian poked at the tent floor with the tip of his shoes. Then we found more fossils, and Dr. Forster started talking about how great it would be if we could use some of them to fit together. I thought since I had the missing piece, maybe I could use it to figure it out, and maybe it would turn out to be an important new discovery, and I might be famous, and then my dad... Julian's voice trailed off. What about your dad? Matt asked quietly. Then my dad might be proud of me, like he is my brother Jack. Amy and Matt exchanged a long look. Julian hung his head low and picked at a seam on his jeans. It's a silly idea, of course. Once I had the fossils, I couldn't make sense of them. I couldn't even figure out a way to put them back in the lab without getting caught, so I put them in a sack and hid them behind a bush. And then Dr. Forster went off to get the sheriff, thinking we'd been robbed by fossil thieves, Amy said. Julian nodded. So last night, I brought the fossils back and put them there on the table. It seemed better than being caught with them red-handed, or having to admit in front of everyone what I did. I didn't think much further than that. No one spoke for a long moment. Julian looked from Amy to Matt and back to Amy again. So what are you going to do? You going to tell Dr. Forrester I stole the fossils? No, but you are, Amy said quietly. I think Dr. Forrester will understand that it wasn't stealing in the normal sense of the word, because your intentions were good. Julian looked doubtful, but he nodded, sighing. You're right. I feel better if I came clean, even if Dr. Forrester decided to send me home. I think your chances are pretty good, actually, Matt said. We'll be there to support you, too, Amy added, and I'll be sure to mention you saved me from that snake. Sudden shouts and the sound of a car horn interrupted her. Dr. Forrester must be back, Amy said. Let's meet her together, okay? Julian nodded and quickly followed Amy and Matt out of the tent. Everyone gathered around the pickup. "Where's the sheriff?" Felix asked as Dr. Forrester got out. "He had something he needed to do, but he will be here by mid-morning," she replied, "and he did help explain the SUV we saw. It was a rancher the sheriff knows, out looking for lost gear." "While we're waiting, let's pack up our gear," Tess said. "We have a long day of excavating ahead." Amy, Matt, and Julian hung back. The other campers followed Tess. "Dr. Forrester," Amy said, glancing quickly at Julian, "would you mind coming to the lab with us? There's something we need to show you." Dr. Forrester looked quizzically from Amy to Matt and Julian and back to Amy again. "No problem," she said. "Lead the way." It took Dr. Forrester only a few seconds to spot the fossils all lined up on the table in the lab. Now this is a surprise. She picked up each fossil, examining it slowly. And there they all are. Even the ones that first went missing. She crossed her arms and looked at them expectantly. "I assume someone's going to explain?" Julian cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am, I am." In a shaky voice, he proceeded to tell Dr. Forrester the whole story. Amy chimed in about the snake, and Matt added that Julian felt really bad. When they were finished, Dr. Forrester was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded as if deciding something. "I appreciate your honesty, Julian. And I hope you've learned that you should always tell the truth right away. Things tend to get worse if you don't." Julian nodded and stared at the ground. "When do I have to leave?" Dr. Forrester put her hand on his shoulder. "It took a lot of courage to confess what you did, and I think your worrying about all this has been punishment enough. You're welcome to stay." Julian beamed a huge smile. "That's fantastic. This camp is the most fun I've ever had." And his smile faded. "But how are you going to explain the others the fossils are back?" Dr. Forrester thought for a moment and said, "Leave this to me." When they all joined Tess and the others, Dr. Forrester held up her hand. "There's been an unexpected turn of events," she said, gesturing towards the lab tent. "The missing fossils have been found. Let's just say," she paused as a hush fell over the group, "our prime suspect is a curious ground squirrel who decided to make off with the bones rather than food." For a moment, everyone was silent. The silence was filled by laughter and loud conversation. Suddenly, Tess's voice rose above the others. "What about the sheriff?" Dr. Forrester frowned. "There's a problem. He's going to make that long drive out here for nothing, and I've got no way to reach him." "You could call him," Daria offered. "I know a place where we can get a cell phone reception." Dr. Forrester looked surprised. "You do?" "I was pretty homesick the other day, so I tried my phone in lots of different places. The other night, I found a spot not far from camp where I got 2 bars. Dr. Forrester dug her cell phone out of her pocket. "Please show me that spot, Daria, so I can call the sheriff and save him the trip." As they left, Amy nudged Matt and whispered, "That explains Daria's late-night walk." When Dr. Forrester and Daria returned, Felix arrived with his huge backpack and set it down on the table outside the kitchen tent. "Gather around, everyone. I'm disappointed we won't get a chance to meet a real Western sheriff, but the return of the fossil calls for a celebration, and I've got just the thing." He unzipped the backpack's main compartment and started taking out candy bars and packets of beef jerky and peanuts, jelly beans and licorice, and all other sorts of yummy treats. "Felix, what is all this?" Tess asked, staring at the growing pile of food. "Survival rations," he said gleefully. "I always carry this much food with me, just in case hunger strikes and the next meal is hours away. And aren't you all dying for a treat?" He smiled his mischievous grin. Matt nudged Amy. "That explains a lot." Amy nodded, pleased with how well things had turned out. The case of the missing fossils were solved, and Julian was able to stay. Fossil Camp felt suddenly right and happy, and she had cracked the case. Our first activity? Can you come up with other plans to catch the thief using chemical and physical changes? See if you can use the materials around the campsite, like ash, wood, and marshmallows, to come up with a new plan. So, we're going to list some physical changes and some chemical changes. What matter Amy uses? What physical change does it go through? What chemical change? What will happen to the matter? Why is this a physical or chemical change? Why does this help catch the thief? And why is this objective evidence? So there's a difference between objective and subjective. Objective means true and 100% fact. Subjective means an opinion. So if I say the objective answer is this, that means it's the only answer. It's not my opinion. It's true. If I say the best movie in the world is Star Wars, that's my subjective opinion or subjective true answer. So it's my opinion, it's not the raw answer backed up by evidence. So we know the physical change Amy used was a bowl of ice cubes to create the water puddles. The chemical change was the plaster of Paris, so they would get on their feet, remember? What will happen to the matter? What happens to a bowl of ice cubes? We know that it melts. That's a physical change. And then for chemical change, we know the plaster of Paris undergoes a chemical change when it encounters that water. It starts to harden. And then you need to give some evidence. You don't have to write exactly what I wrote. Why is this a physical or chemical change? We know that ice is a chemical change because it's reversible and their chemical composition stays the same. Plaster of Paris we know is a chemical change because it's not reversible. It gives off heat and turns into a different form of matter. Remember when they put their hands on the tub as they were creating the mold or the cast? They all said it was warm when they went off, and then they went off to go eat lunch while they waited. We know it's irreversible. It's not reversible either. It's irreversible, which means it can't go back. Why does this help catch the thief? You can kind of put these in either box. The whole point, though, is that I want to hear something along the lines of the water melts, so the thief's shoes get wet, and then the chemical change. When the wet shoes interact with the plaster of Paris, the plaster sticks and it starts to harden like a tracker on the bottom of their shoes. And then why is this objective evidence? Why could you use this plan and no one could argue and say you were trying to get one person in trouble? Only someone who walks into the lab will have plaster of Paris on their shoes. There's no opinion of the person, just evidence of what they took. So it's the difference between me saying, you did this, I think you stole it because I don't like you, and hey, we looked at the camera and it shows you walking in and out. That's objective evidence. There's no opinions or like beliefs. So take a moment to fill in this chart. I'd like you to work independently on this next part about commas and morphology. It's just a review. You're going to add a comma in the correct place in the conversations below. So for that first one, you're just a little bit grumpy today, aren't you? Said Matt. Where would you add a comma? Give you hints in the quotation marks. And then for the morphology, you're just going to select one of the words below to fill in the blank. So make sure you look at your prefix and affixes and read it out loud to yourself. Take a moment. We're going to work on these before we review our answers.